to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, we'll discuss a fun topic, and that's tactics in the endgame. Here we go right away with our first example, which is from a real game between two very strong grandmasters, Nigel Short and the Ukrainian grandmaster Belyavsky. They played this game at one of the super tournaments in 1992 in Linares. It's quite clear that it is White who is playing for a win in this position, because White has a distant passed pawn on the b file, far away from Black's king and the other pawns on the board. However, this is a typical example that it's never too late to make a mistake or never to give up hope, because even super grandmasters can make very serious blunders. Try to think for a moment and see what you would do if you would play White. Black just gave a check by pushing his pawn up from f7 to f6. Black's idea was that if White captures that pawn with a knight, then the pawn on g2 will be hanging and Black will save the game. The correct move in this position for White is to simply retreat the king, making sure not stepping in a pin like the king would on e4, and at the same time still hanging on to the knight in the center. Instead, in the actual game, Nigel Short made perhaps the biggest blunder of his life by moving the king forward to e6. Following the general principle, move forward when you can. The problem here is he couldn't, because this good-looking move sadly allows a checkmate in one move. The bishop simply moved to c8, and all of a sudden, despite having an endgame with not that many pieces left on the board, White just literally walked in to a checkmate trap. Well, hopefully this makes you feel better that even great players make big mistakes. So you're not alone if you're trying to blame yourself for one of your mistakes that you messed up a good position. Of course, the lesson is never underestimate the potentials of your opponent. Look out for dangers, especially in situations when you see that your king has hardly any squares to move to. It's always a danger when a king has no moves or only one or two squares to go to, like here. And here, Black simply checkmated. Let's move on to our next example, where White has a good-looking position, still having the queen on the board, although Black has material balance by having a rook, a knight, and a pawn as compensation for White's extra queen. Nevertheless, it seems that if, for example, if it were White to move or Black doesn't play forcefully, the White queen will get activated by, for example, moving to d3, from there attacking Black's pawn on d4, or perhaps threatening to check and at least guarantee a draw by constantly checking the Black king. However, in our starting position, it is actually Black's turn in this position. The question is how to proceed with Black. One thing we can notice is that the White king is in the corner and in fact has no legal moves. Another thing that's worth noticing is that if the Black knight would get to, say, c3 or d2, either one would then threaten with a checkmate by the Black rook coming down to b1. As you know, it's very important to always look out for your opponent's best defense as well, because only so you can come to the conclusion of what your best move may be. So in this case, if you considered moving your knight to c3 or d2 as a matter of fact, it was important to notice that the white queen would have a very important intermediate move, checking the black king, not needing to bother to defend against the checkmate on b1. And then, when the black king moves away, regardless where on the 7th rank, a fork would follow with queen c7, and the black rook will become history. So let's go back to the starting position and try to figure out a way for still black to come out ahead in this game. And here what you need to look for is a little creativity, a little imagination on how to force the white king into a forking position. Which means is that, as we know, the black knight is able to move his knight to d2 to attack the white queen and the b1 square. So therefore, if we can force the white king to the b1 square, that knight d2 move would be a fork, winning white's queen. Therefore, the correct solution is moving the rook down to b1, not minding even to give up a whole entire rook, because after white's only move, king captures rook, knight d2, check, and on the following move, knight captures queen, leaving black still clearly ahead with an extra knight and pawn, and that's, of course, an easily winning endgame. Let's move on to the next example, where black has an extra knight in this endgame with only 5 pieces left on the board. The challenge is that both sides have rather far advanced passed pawns, and if black chooses to simply advance the pawn, then white will get that same opportunity, and after each pawn promotes, typically queen and knight endgames versus a queen are not possible to win, or when it is, it's extremely difficult, and mostly only computers can accomplish that. However, in our starting position, if again you try to use your imagination and your creativity, you should be able to find the winning sequence for black to win easily, without any complications. Always remember in such type of pawn races that if you would succeed to align your opponent's king with the newly promoted queen on the same diagonal or file in various situations, and you're able to create a skewer, you may be able to win a queen versus queen endgame. In this particular case, it's given that the white pawn will promote on g8 and on no other square. Therefore, if you could imagine the white king ending up, for example, on a square such as e6, which is on the same diagonal with the g8 square, or let's say a square like g4 or g3, now it's not hard to envision the skewer coming from the back, if the king being on the g file, the black queen showing up all of a sudden on g1, or if the white king would end up on g6, then there could be a skewer with queen going to c4. While it is not realistic to force the white king to the g file in this position, it is clearly possible to accomplish to force the white king onto e6. And the way black can do that is by moving his knight to e6 for the moment, which, as we can see, stops the immediate advancement of white's g-pawn to g7. And if king captures knight, then already pawn advances, black promotes, and if the white pawn promotes, here we go, skewer from queen c4, and the white queen gets lost on the very next move. Let's go back just for one moment, one move here, and refresh your memory that if in this position the white king would move next to the pawn in hope to promote that pawn at a later stage. Remember at one of the previous lessons when we discussed how to win endgames as such when one side has an extra queen versus a far advanced passed pawn. Black's method of winning is to force the white king to the promotion square, that is to g8, using that moment to bring the king closer to help the black queen to win the white pawn. The way that would happen, black would start with giving a check, and if white decides not to go to the promotion square, black can, with a few well-placed checks, force the king there by giving a check on g5, which attacks the pawn at the same time. King moves next to it, queen f5, king e7, and now the queen moves right behind the pawn, attacking the pawn, and when the king protects the g7 pawn, then would come queen f6 check, and now white either gives up on the pawn by moving to e8, or it moves under the pawn, which would allow the black king to get closer to the white pawn, and then the win is only a matter of time. Let's move on to our next example, which is from another game of Nigel Short, where again he had an unfortunate moment. It's quite obvious that white's position seems completely winning, having two extra pieces, an extra bishop and knight. However, black, being Larry Christensen, found a very resourceful trap. Obviously, black should not trade queens, because then white's material advantage would prevail sooner or later. However, black found a very cute sacrifice by giving the queen up on f7. Now if white would accept this sacrifice, then black would be ready to force draw by perpetual checks. And simply moving on the third rank, and black would continue with the checks on the third rank, and white would have no escape from all these checks over and over. And after the same position will be achieved a third time, black would claim a draw. So let's go back and see the situation after queen f7, because white is not forced to capture the black queen. In fact, white still is in a winning position if they find the correct sequence from here on. And that is moving the rook to d7. A very elegant move, sacrificing white's own queen. Now, if queen captures queen, white has a very nice checkmate with rook h7. But Christensen found another very tricky idea, again sacrificing his queen. And this time, the British Grandmaster fell for the trap, thinking that after queen takes queen, the checks will run out, because if indeed black tries the same idea, after rook f3, white can simply capture the rook and it's game over. The problem was that black now going back to the position after king takes queen, has a different resource to save the game. Instead of saving the game by perpetual checks, black can save the game by forcing stalemate, and namely playing rook h2, getting rid of the first rook, and then after king captures rook, rook g2, and if king captures rook, the game is immediately stalemate, and if white wants to get away, black will just keep checking along the g file until either the same position will be repeated 3 times, or indeed white captures the rook and the game will be stalemate. And that is a draw. Let's go back to this position again for a moment and check it out after queen takes bishop, rook d7, queen f6. How could have white still won this game? Typically, for such situations, when the danger is that the game will end by stalemate, white should have simply get rid of one of his extra pieces, the rook, forcing black to capture it, and then there is no more danger of stalemate, while white still has a tremendous material advantage, and the checks indeed are running out after king f1. Let's move on to our next example. And here we go. In this position, it is black's turn, and it's not hard to notice that white has a huge material advantage. Another example to never give up hope until there are tricks in the position. What's important to notice here is that the black king and pawns have no moves at the moment. Therefore, capturing the rook on g3 would not be the right choice, because then white would remain still with an extra bishop, which would be again only a matter of time that would guarantee a win for white. On the other hand, if the black queen is able to disappear, then the black king and pawns have no moves, and therefore the game would be a draw. In such situations, it's rather important to remember that it's not enough just to get rid of the queen, for example, by moving to d1, because you also have to make sure that by the time your opponent captures the queen, the stalemate trap has not been released, like it is in this situation, when all of a sudden, since the white queen no longer is on d8, the black king has plenty of escape squares, and we cannot talk about stalemate. Therefore, the correct choice is queen takes b2, which forces white to capture the queen, but it maintains the complete stalemate that none of the black pieces can move. Let's move on to another endgame situation that has only 4 pieces on the board with the kings and the pawn each. Here again, it's important to look for something extra, because if black continues with a natural pawn advancement to c2, the 2 pawns will arrive simultaneously, guaranteeing a draw, because there is no skewer, unlike in the other example we saw earlier in this lesson. What black needs to do in this case is a very typical pattern in similar pawn endgames, to force the enemy king, the white king in this case, onto the same file where the black pawn is about to promote. The way to achieve that is to move to e6 with the king next to white's pawn, preventing it from further advancing, and the only choice that white has is to protect the pawn, whether from c6 or c7, and then the black pawn advances and the pawn promotes with a check, not giving white the time to promote his own pawn. and of course white's position is completely lost. Let's follow up with the next endgame, where we have again material balance. However, remember, even in endgames, look out for tactical opportunities, especially in situations when you see that your opponent's king has barely any moves. All white would need to do is to attack the king, and the king would be checkmated. However, you have to be a little bit resourceful, because the natural looking move g4 doesn't quite achieve the target, even though it threatens by giving checkmate by pushing the pawn further ahead, as well as capturing black's knight. Black would be safe after retreating the knight to e7 and liberating the f7 square for the king. The correct choice in this case is to move the knight to e5, a very brilliant move, threatening with checkmate by rook f7 as well as knight to d7 fork. And of course, most importantly, if the black pawn captures the knight, then pawn captures back and checkmate. A beautiful example. Let's move on. Here we go. In this bishop endgame, black is a pawn ahead. However, the challenge is that we have opposite colored bishops on the board. And very often, having only one extra pawn with opposite colored bishops is not sufficient to win the game. In this case, however, because of the unfortunate positioning of white's bishop, black can win immediately. And again, the resourceful tactic is to force the white king away from the g2 square. In this position, white is in Zugzwang, because after the king moves, king g2, and then the black pawn will simply promote along the h-file. And let's see one more tactic in the endgame. In this position, it was black's turn. Here again, black has an extra pawn, but it certainly doesn't seem easy how to win, considering that white is, for example, threatening immediately with a fork with rook c7. However, if you look carefully and you look out for tactics, you will find quickly that black actually can force a win quite quickly and easily. Again, white is suffering of having more than one piece on the same diagonal or file. This particular case, if black would play bishop a6 trying to skewer white's rook and knight, the problem is that the white rook can move away by giving a check and then move the knight away. Therefore, the best way to guarantee a win here is to temporarily sacrifice an exchange by rook captures knight. Then, when king captures rook, bishop pins the rook, and after pawn protects, d5 uses the pin, and it's game over. And finally, let's check out the jewel of the week. This is quite an amazing endgame composed by Pasternak, where black has an extra rook. And you'd think that white at best can hope for a draw, but nothing more. However, reality is that white has an amazing way to win the game, in fact rather quickly. Try to figure out it yourself and then come back and check out if you got the right solution. Here is the move. Bishop e8. Cutting away the black rook from guarding the promotion square on a8. But what if rook takes bishop? Well, Then, all of a sudden, white combines various elements, that is, threatening to checkmate with a pawn advancement, attacking the rook, and of course having hopes in the a pawn to promote. Black's only move is to try to defend is by playing rook g8, and now a simple deflection by promoting the pawn to a queen, and when rook takes, then beautiful pawn checkmate. I hope you enjoyed this brilliant endgame to end the lesson with, and hopefully it will remind you all the examples we saw, tactics in the endgame, that just because there are not that many pieces left on the board, look out for tactical opportunities. Thank you for listening, and so long until next week.